Today we'll introduce you to the famous Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century scholar. He falls outside of the Western academia's purview and decision making as to who are the contributors to classical social theory. However, you will soon see that this gentleman, the scholar, was in a league of his own. So Ibn Khaldun was a 14th century scholar who is widely regarded as one of the greatest philosophers of the medieval Islamic world. He was born in 1332 in Tunis, which is today present-day Tunisia. Said to be a polymath with contributions spanning several fields, including history, sociology, economics, and philosophy. I remember when I first designed a course on social theory, sociological theory, at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. I introduced the course with Ibn Khaldun, and there were quite a few eyebrows that were raised, but I knew they were not as averse, they were not as perhaps as educated on the subject, so I just let it slide. So Ibn Khaldun was a 14th century scholar, as I mentioned, in the Middle East. So his most famous work is the Muqaddimah, or prolegomena, or introduction. This is considered the first work to systematically analyze the nature of societies and civilizations. In this book, Ibn Khaldun introduced his theory on the rise and fall of empires. Now, I couldn't help but think of people like Wallerstein, Charles Tilly, and so many of these modern theorists that I've covered that kind of go along the same pathways. Here he emphasizes factors like social cohesion, economic conditions, and political structures. His groundbreaking work outlines his philosophy of history and his views on the rise and fall of civilizations, and to a large extent, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels also cross my mind. So what we will do is we will discuss a few key concepts from this text. So the first is Ibn Khaldun argued that the strength of a dynasty or state is closely linked to the concept of social cohesion, and in his language, the first term used from a sociological perspective this way in Arabic is asabiya. So there's social cohesion within especially newer developments of state. He believed that this cohesion was the fundamental bond that kept a group united and provided the social capital necessary to found dynasties and maintain political power. Groups, he argued, with strong asabiya could rise to power, overthrow weaker dynasties, and establish their own rule. The other concept that he proposes is the cyclical nature of dynasties. And in this case, again, when I look at the work of Charles Taylor, Emmanuel Wallerstein, C. Wright Mills, they kind of go along the same sort of line. He proposed that dynasties go through natural cycles of rise, peak, decline, and fall, which typically span 4 generations. Initially, a new dynasty would have strong asabiya, which would help it establish dominance. But over time, however, as the dynasty becomes more comfortable and complacent, its asabiya would weaken, leading to its eventual downfall to a more vigorous group. And then He speaks also in his text of the impact of environment. So Ibn Khaldun also explored how the natural environment and geography affected the development of societies. He noted, for example, that nomadic tribes often had stronger asabiya due to the harsh conditions of desert life, which required tight-knit social groups for survival, oftentimes clans in the Middle East. Conversely, sedentary civilizations, while perhaps more culturally and technologically advanced, tended to have weaker social cohesion over time, making them susceptible to conquest by more cohesive nomadic groups. And then he also speaks on economic factors and labor. Ibn Khaldun considered the impact of economic factors on the state and argued that the ruler's role was to foster a thriving economic environment. He was critical of excessive taxation, which he believed would weaken Asabi and the economy, thus hastening Dynasty's decline. And then he also writes about the role of education and knowledge. And here, of course, we shouldn't apply a modern sensibility in terms of knowledge and education, as the ontologies and epistemologies of knowledge systems before industrial capitalism was very different. Knowledge was not sought to be vocated in a certain field on a factory floor. So education was another critical factor, according to Ibn Khaldun. He saw it as essential for the moral and intellectual development of individuals, and believed that the flourishing of arts and sciences was both a symptom and a requirement of a prosperous civilization. Then, this is where I couldn't help but think of Marx and Engels, as Ibn Khaldun anticipates them, and that's in the area of historiography. Ibn Khaldun was critical of the historical method of his time, which often included uncritical acceptance of historical accounts. He advocated for a scientific approach to history that included skepticism of sources, evaluation of evidence, and consideration of the potential biases of historical narrators. So he's moving away from the emotional to the rational scientific method. And as the slide depicts, that he anticipates Marx and Engels. That's him sitting in the sky watching Marx and Engels having discussions about the German ideology and its German materialism versus the Hegelian ideology. So through these concepts, Ibn Khaldun laid down a framework that not only provided a new way to understand the historical processes, but also contributed to the development of several social sciences. In the end, his work was revolutionary because it systematically analyzed the effects of political, economic, and social factors on the historical and cultural developments of societies. I'm going to end this by citing, if I can remember correctly, certainly not verbatim, but pretty close. I read this from a professor that I met and went to his class when he released his book, The Historical Muhammad, Professor Irving Zeitlin, very famous professor of the past, a social scientist, a theorist, and in his book he writes there, and he's citing Arnold Toynbee, the British historian, and he says, Ibn Khaldun is by far the greatest mind in any time or space.